Hi, I'm Eddie Liu, and this video should be a relatively short comparison of the economic effects of World War I on Canada and the United States. This video will be cut up into short sections focused on certain aspects of each country's wartime economy. Before we start, I'd like to preface too that I'm a high school student, and I, by myself and with no help whatsoever, put this together over the course of one incredibly productive night. So if there are any minor errors, please excuse them. Okay, so first off, war is expensive. In paying for a war, one must account for soldiers' wages, manufacturing supplies, shipping supplies, soldiers' rations, and like a bunch of other stuff. So to this end, in the US, the war cost over $33 billion US, with another $7 billion in loans to their allies expected to be paid back afterwards. By the end of the war, the US debt had amassed to $25.5 billion. However, over two-thirds of this cost was repaid by the American public through Liberty and Victory loans, special bonds issued by the US government. These bonds were sent out 5 times between the time the US entered the war and 6 months after it ended. So, large publicity campaigns headed by the US government were employed to garner the attention necessary to encourage the general population to buy them. For example, the US sought out the services of celebrities like Charlie Chaplin for bond ads and organized aerial displays for the public from the Army Signal Corps for publicity. Additionally, millions of posters and window stickers were put up throughout the war for the same purpose. And with these bonds, the US raised $17 billion, which pays off about half of their war debt, but also inversely putting them into another $17 billion into debt. But don't even worry about it, right? Canada went through a similar process in regards to debt and raising capital actually. As a result of the war, Canada ended up about $2.46 billion in debt, paid off in $164 million increments annually. Additionally, the pre-war government budget, originally $185 million, quadrupled to a massive $740 million during the war. In order to pay off these wartime expenses, the Canadian government relied on the selling of victory bonds, which were basically the same thing as they were in the US. Their publicity, however, was done by advertising them as being direct support for the men overseas. Additionally, the promised interest rate of 5.5% over up to 20 years was an incredibly enticing deal. In the end, Canada raised over $2 billion towards the war effort, and though it saw itself another $2 billion in debt for the foreseeable future, it also saw itself a direct victor of World War I. So, during World War I, armies expended shells like crazy. The sheer volume of artillery fire across Europe consumed more shells than any allied nation was prepared to produce on their own. Seeing this gap in the market, Canada quickly worked to fill it. In fact, in 1916, the Canadian government founded the Canadian Imperial Munitions Board to produce artillery supplies for the Allied forces. By the end of the war, this munitions board supplied 1/3 of all Allied shells, signifying the creation of a massive new source of revenue for the nation. In fact, the value of Canadian exports rose from $68.5 billion in 1915 to $4.44 billion by 1917. Not only did this munitions board fix the shell crisis of 1915, in which the war led to a huge shortage in world munitions, but it also opened up many job opportunities for Canadian citizens. These job opportunities weren't just limited to men though, but for women as well, and this to an extent paved the way for the integration of women into the greater workforce. So you could say an additional effect of World War I on Canada's economy was the progression of women's place in the workplace. In the US, you would see a similar outcome. At this time, the US was not yet the developed war machine that it would become in World War II. However, wartime production did see a significant uptick due to the material demands of the new modern World War I. To meet these demands, actually, the US centralized their national production under the War Industries Board, founded in July of 1917. The war greatly increased demand for American products abroad, specifically food, automobiles, and munitions. The proof here is in the pudding. The total value of US exports grew from $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917. The efficiency of this War Industries Board led to the massive growth of local companies like US Steel, which made $1.2 billion over 2 years in the war, leading to accusations of war profiteering, but I mean that's kind of irrelevant to this video. And though all in all, World War I saw similar outcomes in terms of industrial growth for both nations. Both Canada and the United States grew their industrial bases to meet wartime demand, and both saw a substantial increase in export value and production as well. Now, while the US and Canada might have many things in common with each other regarding effects of the war, their differing roles as debtors and creditors is proof that their paths were not exactly parallel. During the war, it was clear that there was a difference in the global statuses of the two nations. While both faced economic hurdles to the ever-increasing demands of the war, it was ultimately the USA that saw greater economic power come its way. For example, the war left many nations seeking extra cash wherever they could find it, as short-term shortages were incurred, with this cash often coming in the form of foreign loans. Canada would be one of these nations, forced to draw loans from both the UK and the United States. Now, this situation signifies the power difference between the two as a result of the economic circumstances of the war. The United States generally became shifted into the position of the creditor, the affluent, powerful nation with money to spare, while Canada took position of the debtorship role, in which it's forced to call upon the aid of nations more powerful, more well economically equipped. So generally, it would be appropriate to say that the United States went through World War I as a powerful creditor, while Canada stayed in the position of an economic debtor, all due to the economic circumstances put in place by World War I. In general, the effects of the war on the two nations can be summed up by the following thesis statement. I am going to warn you though that the prompt that I was given for this was incredibly weirdly stated, and so I had a lot of trouble writing an actual thesis. So this is the prompt, and the thesis would be: while the US and Canada were affected economically by World War I in a similar fashion in their reliance on bonds to pay off debts and their rapid industrialization, they differed in the wartime roles they played as debtors and creditors. That's it for the video. I hope it was slightly educational, and I hope it wasn't entirely confusing and complicated. And I do admit that the last point on debtors and creditors felt a little weak, I think, but it was hard to find a difference with the Hoda textbook that I have. So this was a fun little experiment. I guess I'll see you in the next video, if I make one.
You will.
Like and subscribe, and send this video to 5 friends for free iPhone 4s.